Good morning, everyone. We're going to take a slightly different approach to Linux this morning. I've mentioned in class that you can use Linux, particularly if you're willing to use a slightly older distro and version, to resuscitate an old computer. I'm going to demonstrate that over the next couple of videos. Now, there are three things you'll need, of course. The computer, boot media, and an ISO image. Now, the first piece of this puzzle is the ISO image, which I am pulling right off the Debian website. I'm going to be using the XCFE ISO because it's a little bit bigger. The next thing is something to boot it from. You can either do this with a CD or with a USB key. Burn the XCFE image to this USB right here. The third piece of the puzzle is the old clunker. And that is this. This is an HP Pavilion. I inherited it from my father after it stopped booting for someone, and they handed it off to him, and he couldn't get it to boot. And long story short, I figured out it had 4 gigs of RAM in it, 2 different 2 gig chips, and one of those chips was bad. I pulled the chip, it started booting, and now I have a very old computer with a little bit of RAM in it. This thing was originally built in 2008. It's has a 32-bit processor, and it was originally running Windows Vista, the poor thing. It's currently running Windows 7 Professional, and honestly not doing a good job of it. So what I'm going to do in order to get this thing back into slightly better shape is to dual boot Windows and Linux. Now, this is something you can do. And once you've got it dual booting one form of Linux, you can do other forms of Linux as well. So, for example, I'm not going to cut this drive in half, as it were, and give half of it to the Windows partition and half of it to Debian. I'm probably actually going to cut it into smaller pieces and probably also load Kali on it at some point. Because Kali's got some interesting Wi-Fi cracking tools in it. You could use this for war driving, war chalking, etc. But not if it's running in a VM. Because if Kali is running in a VM, it thinks it's got a standard wired Ethernet card. It's not going to find your Wi-Fi card unless you find a way to punch through the hypervisor and tell Kali about your Wi-Fi radio. It would be easier, honestly, just to run Kali on the bare metal and let it see that Wi-Fi chip and go from there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this thing in to this computer and boot it. I'll probably have to pivot this camera a bit to show you what I'm doing. Okay, so let's see what we're doing. So we've got the computer. We've got the USB key. I plug in the USB key. I boot it. And this is an HP, so your boot order key is probably F8, F9. This is an old one, Phoenix BIOS. Just spam the key, wait for it to figure out what it wants to do. See, there, I've got my boot menu. I'm going to choose USB hard drive. And see, I used a program called UNetBootin to make this USB key bootable. And notice you see something that looks a whole lot like I think it fell through. Okay, good. It's something that looks a whole lot like a grub menu, only less pretty. So we've got your standard boot process, your standard install process. I've got I need to pick my language, etc., etc. So I'm going to do that in the back end because we've done this a lot. I mean, once you get used to this process, at some point you should more or less be able to just kind of coast through this process. Still pay attention to things like your username, host name, root password, user password, etc., etc. I'll have to do a lot of the same stuff that I would do bringing up any Debian-based systems. Give myself sudo privilege, apt-get update, install the basic toolchain that I want, things like nmap, vim, gvim, my other network tools, etc. The thing that will really make a difference here is getting the network mirror set up, because this is the XCFE image. Okay, and Debian just noticed that I'm using unetbootin, and it's giving me a warning. If you have problems with the installation media, try your installation again without using unetbootin before reporting issues. The installation guide contains more information about how to create a USB installation media directly without unetbootin. It may be what they mean is how to do that in Linux. So we'll try this. It may not work. The other thing to think about here is your drive partitioning. As with any dual boot configuration, you want to put Windows in first. Windows will not tolerate playing second fiddle to Linux. Linux, on the other hand, can handle being the second system in. It's just going to modify your MBR or your GPT to put a reference to itself into the system. So the next thing it's going to choose, because I've got a laptop dealing with, I've got a radio and my Ethernet here, Ethernet there. So it wants me to choose which interface I want to use. I'm going to use my onboard card. Now, there may be another hitch here. This has got an Nvidia graphics card in it. Nvidia graphics and Linux don't always play well together, so I may have to get creative once it's set up to boot into Grub. Once that's working, I may have to change some things, turn the Nvidia drivers off, etc. So pay close attention to what you're doing as you're doing this. You may have to modify the plan while it's in motion. I'm going to pause this video for and I have come to my next decision point. I have to deal with the hard drive. Because we're dealing with a hard drive which already has an operating system which I don't want to destroy, you can't just kind of click through the manual partitioning. What the installer will do if you do that is nuke it from orbit. That's the only way to be sure. So instead, I have to go through this manually, which is something you probably won't have done before. So we have that. So my choices, I'm actually going to go back a little bit. Go back. Okay, so I'm here at my partitioning of the partitioning of the disks. It's setting up the partitioner. Instead of choosing what we did before, which is guided partitioning, sorry, I apologize for the view. Instead of using guided partitioning, I had to go in manually. I don't want to set up iSCSI or RAID or LVM. I want to take this 120 gig Hitachi and split it up. Now, what I want to do is I want to leave this ext4 primary alone. I want to leave this NTFS partition alone. That's probably where Windows is booting from right now. What I want to do is take this 159 gig NTFS partition, it's where Windows really lives, and break it up. What I need to do is resize the partition. And there is a certain amount of risk involved with this. So I'm going to choose to resize is, I'm going to give it 60.9 and continue. Go back. What did I do? Oh, okay. It wants the that value. Okay. And so 60.9 gigabytes. This is, I think, using partman in the background. So it is going to resize the partition, open up some space that I can then use to insert both my Debian and my Kali probably. So what I'll probably do is take that, because I've reduced this partition to its minimum size. Doing the math, I've probably given myself about 90 gigs of open space that I can then cut in half again to give about, or maybe cut it into thirds. 30 gigs for Debian, 30 gigs for Kali, maybe even 30 gigs for another OS, another distro, if I'm really being sneaky with this. Because if you're going to build a security laptop, you might not just want Debian, you might also want, say, the Network Security Toolkit or BlackArch or something like that. So that's going to take a while, so let me pause this again. Okay, so I've made some progress. The installer program, Anaconda, successfully, or parted magic tying into Anaconda, successfully resized my hard drive. Before I jumped with both feet into actually using that space, I wanted to make sure that the dual boot configuration that is my goal, it remains feasible. So I unplugged the boot media, I turned it, and I rebooted the system to try to see if it would boot to Windows. And now it is doing check disk. I'm going to let it do this so that I know quite certainly that the Windows 7 installation, which I might blow away at some point in the future, is still there and stable. I never want, you never, ever, ever, as a technician, want to, as it were, paint yourself into a corner or cut off the branch you're sitting on, to use a slightly more risky metaphor. Always, always, always think about what you're doing. Leave yourself a backup. If you're not sure, check your work before you continue. In a minute, and we will see what the partition menu looks like now that I have freed up approximately 90 gigs worth of drive space. We'll be back for episode 2. Same bat time, same bat channel.